Antes de darmos início ao evento, gostaríamos de reforçar o seguinte disclaimer. As manifestações expressas por integrantes dos quadros da Fundação Getúlio Vargas e por convidados que participam dos eventos e transmissões online representam exclusivamente as opiniões dos seus autores e não refletem, necessariamente, a posição institucional da FGV. Após este vídeo de aviso, solicitamos a autorização para o uso da imagem e da voz dos palestrantes mediante manifestações de concordância, tais como um aceno de cabeça ou outro gesto de aprovação. Agradecemos sua participação e desejamos um excelente evento.
So welcome everyone to this webinar. Just let me ask you if you agree to have this to be filmed and to have your image recorded. Do you agree? Yeah, thank you very much for this, for thumbs up. So welcome everyone to this webinar on the externalization of the EU Green Deal in Latin America through intra and inter-regional instruments, the EUDR and the EU-Mercosur Agreement. This is organized by the FGV Center for Global Law and also by the Jean Monnet Center of Excellence on EU Latin America Global Challenges, and this is co-funded by the European Commission under the auspices of the Erasmus Plus program. I'm Paula Wojciechowicz Almeida. I'm the director of the Center for Global Law and also of the Jean Monnet Center of Excellence here at FGV. And this event is organized with the support of the Institute for Climate and Society, with the objective of discussing the externalization of the EU Green Deal through the EU deforestation-free regulation and also through the EU Mercosur Agreement. So just a few words on our center, if we can share our PowerPoints here just for 2 minutes. My team is going to share the PowerPoints now. So before we begin, the Center for Global Law is a research center at FGV, which intends to achieve competence and knowledge on topics related to global law and governance in Brazil and then also in Latin America, and via collaboration and exchange of knowledge with high-level experts worldwide. Our research center is focused on multidisciplinarity and also on mixed methods, comprising both quantitative and qualitative methods. And our intention is to open a dialogue, a channel of dialogue between researchers and also civil society by reaching out to policymakers, government advisors, and legal experts, practitioners, and academics, as we have everyone here today. So we have developed lots of projects focusing on different topics, and this project now, which is like part of this webinar, is concerning climate change and forests, which is one of our research clusters. So please, next PowerPoint. So the project monitoring the impacts of the EUDR is the part of the climate change and forest cluster and has already published several deliverables, as you can see, which are available online in our platform on monitoring the impact of the EUDR. Some of these include policy briefs, journal articles, books, press articles, reports, among others. You can have here an overview of the most recent publications, including the policy brief on the implementation of the EUDR in Brazil, and also a wrap-up report just following the publication of the EUDR simplification package, and a fact sheet intended to guide Brazilian producers and exporters on how to comply with the norm. This webinar, next PowerPoint, so this webinar will address some of the most pressing issues concerning exactly the EUDR and its indirect application in Brazil, as well as the recently signed EU-Mercosur Agreement and its procedural and substantive challenges. As we all know, the EUDR presents opportunities and also challenges for producing countries, and Brazil, as a host of an extensive forest area and a major player in the international trade of relevant commodities, has shown a special concern with the potential implications of the norm in its economy and also in its society. At the same time, interregionally, the systematic inclusion of trade and sustainable development chapters in EU free trade agreements also embeds the EU sustainability standards and goals, including an aim to integrate sustainability into trade. And this practice is also visible in the recently signed EU-Mercosur Agreement, which is divided into the EU-Mercosur Partnership Agreement and the Interim Trade Agreement, which is provisionally applied from 1st May. And this webinar, the idea of this webinar, next PowerPoint, is to create a space for dialogue exactly on these topics, and is organized by both centers, the Center for Global Law and the Jean Monnet Center of Excellence. And we are going to open this webinar with a keynote address by Frank Hofmeister, the head of the legal department of the European External Action Service. We are particularly honored that he accepted our invitation to be here today and joined us today despite many of his professional commitments. So thank you very much, Frank, for being here. Following the keynote speech, just a few words on the organization of this webinar. So the webinar will be structured in two parts and two panels specifically. So panel 1 will focus on the externalization of the EU Green Deal in Latin America, the EUDR, as an intra-regional instrument, and panel 2 will focus on the externalization of the EUDR, of the EU Green Deal in Latin America, focusing specifically on the EU-Mercosur Agreement as an inter-regional instrument. So today's we have the following speakers. As I mentioned, Frank Hofmeister, the head of the legal department of the EU External Action Service, Josephine Norris, member of the European Commission Legal Service, Mateus Soares Matos, from Barral Pinheiro Parente Law Firm, Gustavo Gaye Miller, senior researcher at the Leuven Center for Global Governance Studies. And then we'll have Augusto Castro, head of the Market Access Division at Brazil's Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Pedro Mariano Martins Pontes, general coordinator at the Brazil's Ministry of Environment and Climate Change. Paolo Gazzotti, head of the unit responsible for relations with Latin America and the Caribbean, and in the Director General for Trade of the European Commission, and Henrique Coer Moraes, Deputy Ambassador to the Netherlands. And finally, my colleague Jan Wolters, who couldn't come here today online, but has also recorded his presentation for the closing remarks. So thank you, everyone, for accepting our invitation to be here today, and the audience as well, present here online. We have also with us the researchers from the Center for Global Law who are there, and they are titled CPDG and CEGM, which is the Center for Global Law and the Jean Monnet Center of Excellence. So in particular, I would like to thank the organizers of this event together with me, who made this event possible, Leonardo Bortoloso Rossi and Mariana Mariani, who will also intervene here in this panel as discussants in the first and the second panel. So now, without further ado, I'll give the floor to our keynote speaker, Frank Hofmeister. He's also a professor for EU External Relations Law in the LLM in International and European Law program of the Brussels School of Governance, and he also holds a PhD from the University of Heidelberg. And he's going to speak about international trade and sustainable development between unilateral, bilateral, and multilateral approaches. So the floor is yours, Frank. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, dear Paula. It's a great honor for me to open this panel, which I consider is super timely and deals with a topic which is on the mind of policymakers and has a growing attention also here in the European public. Since you have a variety of excellent speakers, I've seen a bit what are the main challenges from a legal perspective. And of course, the starting point is unilateral regulation of sustainable development. Every nation is sovereign to set its standards. In democracies, these standards would also reflect the expectations of the citizens. And that means that a state may have a very high or less ambitious environmental protection program, but that may also come with considerable costs, which a society must bear. And importantly, the society can also decide under which rules foreign products can enter the market. So market access regulation is therefore a matter of choices. And in the EU, it is true that over time we have more regulating market access and therefore also interfering somehow in global value chains. Because of this trend, academics and practitioners look into the matter in more and more detail, and I would like to give a special applause to my colleague Josephine, who you will hear in the first panel, because she has written a very good book on this, EU global value chain regulation, which I can only recommend because it has a chapter not only on the deforestation, but also on other issues like due diligence, or if I may say so, forced labor, which is social standards, but still, it's the same issue. It wants to be progressive from its own view, evading the matters, but at the same time, this has restrictive effects on other nations, and how this is legally done needs a proper explanation. So, coming to bilateral and regional, then of course, seen from the perspective of a trading partner, such unilateral approaches may go too far, may become even, let's say, discriminatory. Why do you regulate products from my country, very detailed, and you distort competition? That's something which is a very serious concern. Sometimes it goes even further, that people would argue that, well, there is hidden protectionism involved. Yeah? On the face of it, you do neutral regulation, but in reality, you want to curb legitimate trade of other nations. It's your intention to impose hidden trade restrictions. And these are concerns which should not be taken lightly, because in democratic societies like the EU, there may be different views. You may have people who are protectionists. You may have others who are earnest. And in order to find out what is really happening, the democracy decides. We have the institutions who then will come up with the relevant majorities. So this means that in a bilateral regional matter, the different views come together, and one tries to find out, is there a possibility to find a solution which will be acceptable for both sides? And therefore, a free trade agreement such as Mercosur interim trade agreement is also a sign of building bridges, of trying to convince each other that there is a possibility of a common ground when we lay down certain principles which, on the one hand, accept that there is unilateral regulation, but on the other hand, make an effort to make it work in practice and avoid unnecessary, excessive rules in its application. And this is something which you will then find in the S&D chapters, Sustainable Development chapters, that the EU is negotiating. And I cannot go into great lengths, but we have started this 20 years ago already. So Mercosur is not the first. It is in a line of many predecessors, some novelties. And here I'm super happy to see that in the second panel, we also have real negotiators among us. So there is my esteemed colleague Paolo Gorzotti, but also Enrique Kyo from Brazil, who have been in the room and trying to make it happen. So they can really tell you of how to reconcile the views, in particular on a very, very difficult topic, namely how to integrate, and that's my third point, global standards, like the Paris Agreement on climate change. Is it possible to make a global standard a fact that if you don't comply with the global standard, you are then in breach of a bilateral commitment? Is that something legally possible, and how was it solved in the EU Mercosur case? And I think that's a very interesting debate, and I'm sure my colleagues will talk about this in their presentations. So, dear participants, dear Paula, this brings me to an end of my very short presentation, just to make the point that yes, sovereign decisions on Green Deal and high environmental protection, climate protection is legitimate. At the same time, this raises concerns of other nations, which are also legitimate. And we as lawyers, we may find out how to balance these competing interests in treaties such as Mercosur and Sustainable Development chapters. And I'm pretty much convinced that is a good example of how two important trading partners may come together. And I hope that this panel will offer sufficient possibilities to go into detail. So thanks again for making this happen, for this exchange of views. And I wish all participants a very good seminar right now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Frank, for your insightful and thought-provoking remarks, and your presentation provided us with this overview, right? A comprehensive overview of this relationship between trade and sustainable development across the norms and also across the multilateral agreements, and discussing the possibility to make global standards and well, binding and related to compliance of the agreement. So this is something that is very interesting and important, and I also wish to have more discussions on this in the panels following this presentation. So thank you very much for this, and thank you for sharing your expertise with us, your experience with us, and for setting the stage, right, of what is going to be a rich exchange of views between all of us. So please now thank you, Professor Hofmeister, for this excellent keynote address. And as I'm moderating the first panel, I'm going to start to open the first panel and introduce our speakers on the topic of the externalization of the EU Green Deal in Latin America, the EUDR as an intra-regional instrument. So our first speaker is Josephine Norris, who is currently a member of the EU Legal Service of the WTO and International Trade Policy team at the European Commission. She advises on trade-related aspects of climate policy, and she coordinates investment arbitration disputes and litigates on behalf of the Union in different international fora, such as the WTO, the ICSID, the PCA, and the ICJ, as well as before the Court of Justice of the European Union and national courts. As Frank has also mentioned, she's the author of the book EU Global Value Chain Regulation, a practical guide, which I have here with me. Thank you so much for this, Josephine. And this book has been published last year in 2025, and it's really timely and it's really useful for all of us who are working on the topic. So Josephine is also adjunct professor at the Vrije Universiteit in Brussels, among other universities. Just announcing our two other speakers before giving the floor to you, Josephine. So our second speaker is Matheus Soares Matos, partner at Barral Parente Pinheiro Lawyers, where he focuses on governmental relations and public law matters. His practice involves advising clients on institutional engagement, regulatory strategy, and the interaction between businesses and public authorities, including on regulatory measures such as the EUDR. Our third speaker now is Gustavo Gaia Miller, senior researcher at the Leuven Center for Global Governance Studies at KU Leuven, Belgium. His research addresses the external action of the European Union, EU foreign and security policy, Europe-Latin America relations, and also comparative regional integration and Brazilian foreign policy. So now I'm going to give the floor to you, Josephine, our first panelist on the topic of EU Global Value Chain Regulations, the EUDR. You have 10 minutes for your talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to join you, and thanks also for the kind introduction. We started by hearing how the European Green Deal is ambitious, and within the European Green Deal, the EUDR is itself an ambitious piece of legislation. It's no secret that it is a piece of legislation which has ignited discussions with the EU's partners over not only the model that it applies, but also the practicalities of implementing the rules that it sets down. So it's tempting when talking about the EUDR to dive straight into the details about the due diligence standards and country benchmarking and just practically how an operator can trace their goods. But I wanted to actually zoom out and look at why the EU even chose this regulatory model to address deforestation. So the starting point then is that the EUDR is not alone. It is one of a series of regulations that seeks to address a transnational phenomena, in this case, deforestation, and in particular, the impact that that has on climate change. And it does so by regulating explicitly along the value chains that are connected to the EU's internal market. So the core proposition behind the EUDR is that EU's consumer demand for certain products should not be a driver for further deforestation. So in other words, it's addressing an issue of global concern through market access regulation, as Frank explained. It sets conditions on which products can now come into the EU market, and importantly, because it's often forgotten, which ones may leave the EU internal market. It applies to exports as well as to imports. So why does the EU even want to regulate along a global value chain? And I think that in my assessment, there are different drivers for this choice of regulatory model, and I wanted to touch briefly on them. The first is a values imperative. That is because there are negative externalities associated with the, in fact, incredibly high consumer demand in the EU for certain products which are absolutely associated with deforestation. And citizens care. There have been many surveys across the EU which show that the EU citizen really wants to address deforestation, and that is why the impetus for this regulation also came through the European Parliament. So it's very clear that it's connected to a broader policy. So the EU is, in other words, addressing a question of its values. There's also a participation imperative. The EU is embedded in many, many aspects of international trade flows. It is a participant in EU value chains. It is a recipient of products that move along global value chains, and it has an interest in defining the rules proactively that are going to apply to products moving along them. There's also within the EU a harmonization imperative. The EU is composed of many member states. Within those member states, there are different degrees of ambition in how you address deforestation. And so the EU needs to prevent fragmentation within its own internal market of how it deals with these issues. And finally, there is perhaps the more controversial aspect, which is what I've referred to as an externalization imperative. The EU is a big proponent of green diplomacy. It wants to lead global standards in addressing some of these phenomena and to, frankly, raise the regulatory bar. So what then does the EUDR actually set out to achieve? Well, it is trying to address the entire value chain that connects a product from its source back to the internal market or from the internal market to be exported. And it does so explicitly to address what we would refer to as these broader sustainability objectives, deforestation being an example of that. And it applies a due diligence model, which has certain implications. In particular, that places a burden on the operators, because they are the importers. They are the ones who have to apply traceability, look back along their value chains, make sure that they comply with the requirement to prove that their product meets the conditions needed. And this has certainly challenges. And I think that the main challenge relates to implementation. And by that, I'm talking specifically about the feasibility of actually meeting the technical requirements. And this is a topic which has been discussed by the EU extensively with many of its partner countries and those who are actually trying to bring these rules to being, because a rule on paper is one thing, a rule in practice is something entirely different. Another challenge, of course, is the interaction with domestic legislation. The EU is not the only country in the world, fortunately, to care about deforestation. Many countries have expressed considerable concern over precisely the same phenomenon and have applied their own approach to addressing that within their national territory. So inevitably, in a partner country, there may be a different form of legislation which seeks to address one way or another the same concern. And then the question is, how do you take into account that existing normative framework? And finally, I think there's a challenge in terms of what this means for cooperation between the EU and its partners. How do these rules, which are autonomous legislation setting cross-cutting market access conditions, interact precisely with bilateral agreements? What happens when you negotiate an FTA, which takes precedence? Can you agree to opt out of certain legislation, or which one should really hold the floor? So all of these questions, which are very real questions, as I said, have been discussed at length with many partners, show precisely why the EUDR is an ambitious and challenging measure to implement. And of course, it is until now, in fact, not really being tested, because what we've seen is the two progressive delays to the entry into application of the legislation. And that in itself has significant implications for operators, because those who are trying to bring themselves in line are left in a certain degree of uncertainty as to precisely the timelines that there are to make sure that they are compliant. But the purpose, of course, of delaying this entry into application is to allow for these further discussions and refinements and simplification of the rules to try and address some of the first issues I mentioned, which relates to the implementation itself. So I certainly don't want to abuse my time, but in conclusion, I think it's important to understand that the EUDR is not just an isolated instrument. It is part of this series of regulatory instruments, all trying to do the same thing, just with a different sustainability-related objective at the end of it. So it is part of a package of measures which look at the way that modern trade functions, i.e., in terms of fragmented global value chains, and says, to be effective, to really meet my sustainability objective or my climate objective, I need to look at how trade actually operates in practice. And the way to deal with the EU's contribution to this phenomenon is to address it in the form of market access regulation. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Josephine, for this very clear presentation. So it's also important for us to have your views and to have the views of the EU on how the EU has been addressing this transnational phenomenon. And as we all know, the EUDR is not an isolated instrument, and it's interesting to understand the choices of this regulatory model, as you has just explained, and the let's say the challenges that follows exactly this ambition, right? This regulatory measure, which is considered by all of us as ambitious. So thank you very much for this. And now I would like to move to Mateus Soares Matos, who will tell us about the indirect application of the EUDR in Brazil. So now we will have the point of view of the Brazilian operators and traders, and what are the legal challenges that they are facing. Thank you. So the floor is yours, Matheus.
Thank you, Professor, and thank you for FGV and Jean Monnet Center for the invitation. It's actually an honor to have the opportunity to discuss it with regulators and the academy from both sides of the discussion, Brazil and the EU. So congratulations for the organization. My contribution follows Josephine's speech about the comprehension that the UDR is not a single initiative, and somehow, as also Frank mentioned, we might be seeing how can a regulation, even though it's not isolated, can contribute for a global standard, because from a private lawyer advising agriculture and trading companies that are actually looking abroad, since the Brazilian commodities global chain is already established for a little while now. We're facing some discussion. There are being more pragmatic and more understanding that at some point we'll need to address these obligations, because the EU market is too important to we just look with less care, and to understand that despite other buyers in the globe, the premium, the more sophisticated products, the high standard product that Brazil is capable to produce is what is demanded by the EU consumer. So in this perspective, I would like to share with you some of what my experience during the previous year has been advising these players here, because we're quite a little bit letting go the situation that we are trying to face, and to challenge the circumstances, and trying to understand how we can adapt, because well, it's a reality. Despite we having these these pushaways from the actual beginning, such as Josephine said, what is actually on the table right now, and it's some of the discussion that I'm having with some clients and some associations here in Brazil. First of all, UDR, as part of a complex sustainability regulation drafted by the European Union, such as also the CBAM, and also when we look for the biofuels industry that itself, it's a controversial issue to be addressed. But the reality in Brazil is that the agriculture and then the commodities supply chain is too integrated, and sometimes it's really deep connected to players in Europe. So as suppliers of raw materials, inputs, so these products, agricultural products, can be industrialized in Europe or nearby countries. We see that the complexities brought by UDR is not only, sometimes maybe go even further than those scope products that we're seeing. Well, for biofuels, we need to discuss whether disruptive feedstocks for the production of sustainable aviation fuel, for example, will drop inside the rules of the UDR, when we consider, for instance, that some of these feedstocks are being produced in degraded lands that are being converted to be a productive area, even though it falls inside the cutting line of deforestation or degradation of the land of 2020. So even though that product is produced in a degraded land, and recovering the land once the feedstocks, the crops are being produced, and sometimes palm trees that are different from soybeans and etc., there's still a risk, there's still the concern that this product will face some challenges entering in Europe, even though it's originated by recovery of the degraded lands. So this is the first situation that we need to deal in in a specific client that aims to be the leading producer of sustainable aviation fuel in Brazil. The second one, I believe it's a reality not only in the EUDR, but also in the CBAM. Also, when we talk about international financial reporting and sustainability, that is what we can call Scope 3, supply chain. Well, the major players here in Brazil, even though they are preparing to adapt to the regulations, some of them still have a quite large and integrated supply chain that parts from the individual producer, the small farmers that are reaching out to try to adapt to the demands that these big players are now imposing for the acquisition. And some might think that, well, it wouldn't make sense to demand this, because even though the European Union is an important market for destination of these goods, these commodities, Brazil also negotiates with other countries such as the Asian countries and etc. But what we are seeing here is that operationally and logistically, some companies do not have the logistic and operational conditions to segregate the production at the beginning, from the beginning, of what will be exported to Europe or what will be exported to China. So once the standard of the regulation of the EUDR, for example, it's higher than the ones that we need to when accessing other countries, what we're seeing is somehow that the EUDR and other regulations are pushing forward a standardization in all the commercial relations that are being established. Because, for example, once I collect the soybeans, it's really difficult to see a producer here in Brazil segregating those harvest results when considering that, no, this will be a DCF soybean, this will be a non-DCF soybean. So the consequences are being, well, I will need to input this cost, this additional compliance costs of exporting to Europe, to my other exporting routes. This necessarily is not we might think that in terms of public policy, it's we all assume that EUDR and EU regulation, Green Deal regulation, is ambitious, but we see how, even though the challenges that we have between the bilateral agreements and negotiations, it's somehow pushing forward the idea of standardizing a pattern where players and exporters are concerned about sustainability rules to achieve international markets. And the third topic that I'll bring to the table is that after the introduction of the interim trade agreement related to the Mercosur EU agreement, at least the companies are reaching out to us to understand how will they need to prepare and to interact with the Brazilian government and afterwards the EU regulators to present and to try to consolidate the reality of Brazil, in which the environmental licensing changes from state to state. The kind of native vegetation changes from region to region. Of course, the discussion we all know, the concept of forest in Brazil, well, we have at least 20, just to exaggerating, but this is something that the same player have a reality in the south region of Brazil, and in the north region of Brazil, it falls upon different standards of regulation. So yesterday we were discussing with the Ministry of Agriculture of Brazil that how can we integrate, even trying to organize something during the London Climate Week, how can we integrate these challenges in order not only to challenge the idea that EU is now demanding these criteria, this due diligence to be presented, but also doing our homework on trying to present foreign regulators the Brazilian legislation, that it's really complex itself. So it's quite positive that when we see in Annex 18 of the ITA the possibility of somehow pushing forward on the necessity of addressing national legislation from the exporting countries. But we also understand that we have the burden to make it clear, even because the templates will still be drafted by the EU regulators, but to make it clear on how to report this and how to explain our reality. And maybe from 2025 to now, this past year, what the discussions change for this kind of aspects. So in order to respect the time that I have, it would be these three issues. So how this is somehow affecting not only the export that I'm doing to the EU, but how this reflects in the other destinations that a Brazilian is sending its products, and how we will prepare to the openness that the ITA Article 18 brought to the table, that brings the European regulators to understand and to be more open to evaluate national legislation and regulation. So that will be it for today. Thank you all for the attention.
Thank you very much, Matheus, for this very practical insights on the challenges that are being faced by operators and also by traders in Brazil, as far as the UDR is concerned, and also as far as the EU-Mercosur Agreement is concerned, and as well as the interaction between them and also on the national legislation, right? So it was very clear. Thank you very much for this. And now I'm going to turn to Gustavo Gaia Miller to bring his perspective on the topic of Brazil's multi-layered contestation of the UDR, from bilateral pushback to multilateral coalitions. You also have 10 minutes for your talk, Gustavo. Thank you very much for being here, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Paula, and the FGV team for the invitation. This is indeed a very timely topic. And I agree with my fellow panelists that EUDR is indeed part of a package, right? If anything, I believe it was at the peak of the Green Deal, right? This process of negotiation and implementation, a Green Deal that, of course, we see that has been diminished, given the new focus on competition. But I would argue as well that EUDR it can be quite unique, right? Because if anything, it is mostly on commodities, and by being mostly on commodities and on products that the EU itself does not produce, right, with the exception of meat and wood and related products, it establishes a clear north and south relationship, right? And because of that, that's what we argue in our research here at K11, is that it produces a particular kind of contestation, right, coming from global south countries, and in this case, particularly from Brazil, because while most countries would have one or perhaps two products that are targeted by EUDR, Brazil really scores the highest, right, of all of those products, with the exception perhaps of palm oil. So what has been Brazil's reaction, right, since the inception of the measure? And here we see from the beginning, going back to 2021, sort of a participation in the formal consultation processes, and yet a core argument that comes out of those consultations from Brazilian diplomacy, arguing that trade measures should not be the response for environmental goals. Right. Later in 2021, while the measure was being passed through ordinary legislative procedure here at the European Union level, Brazil also engaged with various actors on the EU legislative process. So from the European Parliament rapporteur to members of parliament, and also to individual member states, capitals, and also, of course, to the business sector itself, right? Because while the private sector in Brazil and in global south countries would also oppose or have reluctance towards the measure, also business in Europe were not very keen on accepting the measure as it was offered at the beginning. While they would say it was legitimate, they would say that problems on the implementation technical aspects were rather clear. So what were the main, let's say, points of contestation coming from Brazil throughout this period, so in the last 4 to 5 years? First of all, Brazil would argue that there is indeed a shared objective here, right? That's the fight against climate change, that conservation and sustainable initiatives, especially for forests, are indeed urgent tasks that should be followed upon. But Brazil would then contest the measure in 2 different layers, right? The first one is the more technical, right? And here issues such as the benchmarking system and the potential discriminatory nature of that benchmark system would be raised. And also, as mentioned before by my fellow panelists, the difficulties in the implementation, such as the practicalities of traceability, and geolocation, but also issues such as, well, what counts as forest and what counts as deforestation, given the diversity of national and sometimes subnational regulations as well. So these are more the technical contestation bit, right? While the EUDR was also very much contested on principle, right? And here, I would say the main argument has been at various levels, by the way, both at the bilateral level, but also at multilateral level, such as at the World Trade Organization. The argument has been that the fight against climate change and the fight against deforestation should first and foremost take place at the international level, right? So this should be a multilateral engagement instead of an unilateral measure. And here we see very much Brazilian diplomacy, but also connecting with other Global South countries, arguing that Global South concerns were largely were not taken into account during the design phase of EUDR, and many of the definitions, again, such as what counts as deforestation, had not been mutually agreed. Another argument would be that EUDR largely then disregards the principle that's already established in international practice of common but differentiated responsibility for everything that touches upon fight against climate change and environmental degradation, right? So in this sense, what is being argued then is that EUDR is punitive by design rather than offering positive incentives to diminish and deforestation. So, for example, a producer could be excluded from EU market, and such producer would then lose all incentive to stop deforestation in his or her land. Then, of course, there is the argument in principle that existing national legislation, and if we look at Brazil in particular, we can look at the forest code, but also the rural registry, right, and all sorts of national certifications. The argument here in principle would be that all these national systems should be more strongly taken into account, right, as EUDR, and that we should rather, for efficient reasons, but also as a matter of principle, take those into account as well. And finally, there's the issue of the unintended consequences coming out of such an unilateral measure, right? It would be argued does not take into account the specificities of different countries, which is, of course, first and foremost, I think we are discussing it because of that, diplomatic tensions. But second, there are issues of trade diversion that I think Mateus already touched upon that. Let's say those producers that are excluded from the market, they lose much of the incentive to comply. And then there is, of course, those that are in certain countries, let's say, the producers that are in Brazil and complying with the measure, they might see that their efforts are not really rewarded because there is a trade relocation to other countries. So these have been basically the arguments, both in principle and technical, coming from Brazil. And here we see an interaction between both Brazilian diplomacy, but also the relevant ministries, most notably, of course, the Ministry of Agriculture. And just to conclude, I think it's also relevant, especially in the case of Brazil, to see that over the last 2 years, contestation has taken place in various multilateral channels, and also coincided with the fact that Brazil was actually hosting major international events that touched upon indirectly or directly on sustainability and environmental issues. Of course, most notably, that was the COP30, that in many ways offered a positive alternative to EUDR in the shape of the Tropical Forest Forever initiative, right? So we can see that it's not only about contestation, but it has also been about proposing positive alternatives. And Brazil, as you all may know, also hosted the BRICS Summit and the G20. Here, when we compare these two summits, we see that, well, with different language, of course, because while the EU participates in the G20, it does not participate in the BRICS, right? So, but we see that with different language, there's a similar argument, right, against the unilateral measures or undue measures that would use trade for achieving environmental goals. But we also see counter proposals, right? And so in the same line as the Tropical Forest Forever, we would see, especially the G20, advancing the idea of bioeconomy, right? And an economy that works for the people, then the communities that live in the forest areas as well. Just to conclude very briefly, of course, this is the contestation coming from Brazil, to a certain extent from Global South countries, West Africa, Southeast Asia. But I think much of the story of EUDR contestation is also internal, right? And I think if anything, the multiple delays and the revisions of EUDR have also to do with internal oppositions that we see in the European Union. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Gustavo, for your perspective on the Brazilian contestation of the EUDR, including this technical measures related to contestation, and also the contestation principle, and also the fact that Brazil is also proposing some complementary or some alternatives, right, which can be addressed together with the existing mechanisms. So thank you very much for this. And now we are closing the first panel. But before this, we have our discussant, who is Mariana Mariani, the researcher of the Center for Global Law and the Jean Monnet Center of Excellence. She will have 2 minutes to address some of the questions that we could address to the panelists, and also maybe you could have 1 minute each to respond if you intend to do so, right? So you can choose whatever you feel that is more interesting to discuss here in this 5 minutes that are left for us. Thank you very much. And now, Mariana, please, you have the floor.
Professor Paula. Thank you, Mr. Miller, Ms. Norris, and Mr. Matos for your insightful presentations. Very thought-provoking. We have some questions and divided into 4 main topics for you that relate to what you have said to us now today. The first one is regarding certification. So the May 2026 simplification review encouraged the submission of information that is held within national databases of third countries, and also announced a forthcoming establishment of a centralized repository of relevant legislation. So in this regard, in your opinion, how is this development of integration of third country databases is being done, and how this could be further developed to contribute to the recognition of criteria for third country certification, monitoring, and traceability? In the sense to facilitate the implementation in third countries and throughout legal instruments. Also, one point that was raised by all the panelists was this interaction with the national legislation. And in this regard, as mentioned by Mr. Matos and Mr. Miller, Brazil has an interesting case of permitting a certain degree of deforestation under Article 26 of the Brazilian Forest Code. And I would like to hear from you, in your opinion, how is this design choice of treating lawful and unlawful deforestation identically for the purpose of market access? And what is the importance of the zero deforestation tolerance criteria of EUDR? And lastly, in regard to the interaction of the EUDR and the WTO, what can we learn from the palm oil litigations before WTO, considering the alleged characterization of the EUDR as a non-product related process, and and which entails GATT Articles 1 and 3 for potential application. And if I may, just one last question, if you could briefly comment on the interaction of the EUDR and the EU-Mercosur Agreement, especially regarding Annex 18A Articles 15, 55C, and 39, which allows for the Mercosur certification schemes to be used when there is a conflict with the EU ones, and also provides a list of products that are related to that were produced sustainably and that could be granted preferential access to the EU markets. I think this will be the 4 topics of discussion for me.
So back to you all. Who would like to start?
Well, if I may, Professor. Well, trying to summarize and be brief, I think that thinking about interoperability between these mechanisms of report is fundamental. We're seeing that in other multilateral platforms of integration of normative realities, such as the Article 6 discussions, 6.4 discussions, the Open Coalition for Carbon Market. So parties are investing in trying to understand and to collect this multilateral perspective because, as Gustavo said, I also agree that these kind of discussions are born to occur in the international forum. So this on the first topic. And afterwards, of course, even though we talk about interoperability, we will still need to understand from the EU regulators what will be the format, what will be the extension, the subjective extension, the material extension of the assessment that will be need to presented to them about our legislation. So this will be my first topic. About the tolerance for deforestation in the Brazilian legislation, I think this might be one of the most controversial items in my opinion, because this is the topic where I see the producer here in Brazil less willing to go for, and when the nationalism of the legislation become stronger, in my opinion. And afterwards, talking about the Article 18, topic 55, I actually see this quite positively because I believe this open the road for us to have on other legal instruments the capability to discuss and to elaborate on these challenges that we have, because this will not occur from night to day, and what we need to be willing and we need to be prepared to do this discussion. And we as Brazilian producers and with interaction with our regulators, we need to be prepared to address this. The market's necessities in where we want to be. I mean, if we want to be in Europe, our products want to be in Europe, we'll need to chase that and to adapt to that with the sovereign discussions and the negotiation. But I'm positive, I'm quite optimistic about what Article 18, Annex 18, Article 55 bring to us. And I believe it strongens the capability and the willing of the European regulators to discuss these particularities of Brazilian legislation.
Thank you, Mateus. Other reactions? Josephine, would you like to say
I
a few
will just
words?
jump in on a few points. So on the first question, I think it's clear that everyone has an incentive to make implementation simpler and easier, because everyone wants the legislation to actually be implemented. So I think that the point of the simplification review is to say that in principle, the objective is actually just to have verifiable and reliable information. And if there are ways to facilitate collecting that information, then that's something that should be worked towards. So, I mean, I think you can always look at different ways within a legislative framework or different regulatory tools to look at that. You can talk about formal equivalence, or you can talk about acknowledging validity of data. I mean, but I think that there is definitely a willingness to explore the different avenues to just make it more effective on the ground, the legislation. I think on the second question, what is the point of the distinction? Is it fair to have no distinction between legal and illegal deforestation based on national legislation? I mean, the whole point of the EUDR is to say that it's implementing a very specific environmental objective, and it's saying it's addressing EU consumption. So if you view it through that prism, then it's not really about the legality of the deforestation. It's about whether the deforestation is happening. So that, of course, I mean, we can understand that creates a certain tension when you have national legislation. But if you look at the objective of the measure, I think it sort of flows from the core of what the EUDR is trying to do. Briefly, though, on the third question, full disclosure, I was an agent for the European Union in the palm oil cases. So I think, personally, my personal opinion is that, yes, there's been a lot of academic debate over NPR PPMs for years in the WTO context. Is that really still the central question? I'm not so sure. I think what is clear from all recent WTO jurisprudence is that members can pursue environmental objectives through measures that address trade. And that has been a progressive evolution in the case law of the WTO. And actually, for me, the central point of the palm oil litigation was that it was very clear that climate change, it is an objective. It is a legitimate regulatory objective, whether we're under the TBT agreement, whether we're under Article 20. It brought the two tests, frankly, much closer together, I would suggest. And so that it was that's an important point for the future. That's not really going to be the discussion anymore. The discussion will therefore always continue to be on the question of how a measure is applied in practice. We talk about that in terms of the chapeau under Article 20, or whether you talk about that in terms of arbitrary discrimination. And I think that the actual finding on discrimination in palm oil was on a very narrow point and linked to a very specific aspect of the design. I'm not going to go into all of the details, but what does that tell us about the future way that measures will be evaluated? Well, that it will always be a question of looking not so much at the objective, unless it's really the case where it's green protectionism opposed to a genuine environmental measure. And that's always going to be a debate that's had. But once you're over that threshold, you're always going to be looking really at the implementation in practice. So I'm not sure that the debate on PPMs is really the central question anymore. I'm also not sure that this is really a revelation, because I think if you look at the entire history of WTO environmental cases, you would see that every single one, more or less, turns on the chapeau in many ways. So I'm not sure that we're much further on in that sense. So there we go. I think what it does tell you is that this type of regulation is certainly not precluded. And for Mercosur, I leave that to others to address. Thank you.
Perfect, Josephine. Thank you. Thank you for these clarifications. Gustavo.
Thank you, Paula. I'm also mindful of the time, so let me focus on the last one and perhaps already make the connection to the second panel. I think for the case of the EU-Mercosur trade negotiations, right, that of course clashes with EUDR. While one is liberalizing trade, those are the negotiations. The other one at least presents the possibility of non-tariff barriers kicking into the process. But I do see EUDR coming into the Mercosur EU trade negotiations as a leverage, right? And I think we can see in many ways the rebalancing mechanism addressing that, or potentially addressing that. Now, if you ask Brazil and EU on the potential uses of the rebalancing mechanism at this point, we're probably going to get different answers. This has already been discussed, by the way, over the last few days, given the new issue around the embargo on Brazilian meat. But we do see also, in a way, alternatives to EUDR, or sort of more positive-oriented measures that, as you say, appear in the final version of the deal, in particular Annex 18. I think the duty of consultation is clearly a reference to that. But I would also highlight that, as it was mentioned in the questions, right, item 39 is very much about valuing the bioeconomy, right? And this idea that certain products, as they are presented by Mercosur countries, signatories, that if those products that are connected to the forest and bioeconomy, those products could get eventually an easier access to the European market. So I think there is that connection as well between the idea of preserving forests through positive incentives and what comes into the trade liberalization. Thanks.
Thank you, Gustavo. This is the perfect connection with the next panel. So thank you again, all the panelists, for this very enriching discussion. And now we are going to move directly to the second panel. I'm going to pass the floor to Augusto Castro, the head of the Market Access Division at the Brazil's Ministry of Foreign Affairs. He's going to moderate our second panel with the participation of high-level negotiators of the EU-Mercosur Agreement, including Paulo Gazzotti, Henrique Coelho Moraes, and Pedro Pontes. So thank you very much, everyone, and the floor is yours. Augusto, please.
Thank you very much, Paulo. Can you hear me?
Yes, perfectly.
Thank you very much. So first of all, I'd like to thank FGV and especially Professor Paulo Almeida for this very kind invitation. It's a great pleasure to moderate this very distinguished panel. Before I start, just the usual disclaimer, everything I say here is just my own thoughts and ideas and does not necessarily reflect the views and position of the Brazilian Ministry of Foreign Affairs or the Brazilian government. Let's get started. As you know, the Mercosur EU trade agreement has been signed in last January. It has been provisionally applied from the 1st of May onwards. Of course, we still have to wait for the legal opinion of the European Court of Justice, and after that, the approval of the agreement in the European Parliament. The TSD chapter, of course, is a central part of the agreement. Its final outline and structure, as you also know, were only defined in the very last stage of the negotiations in 2023, 2024, the so-called Brasilia package. Broadly speaking, the main objectives of the TSD chapter are twofold. First, to ensure the integration of sustainable development considerations in the trade and investment relationship between the two sides of the agreement. In other words, to ensure that all the trade and investment flows that will be created by the agreement will be fully aligned with the main international regimes in the environmental, social, and sustainability areas. And second, to prevent, of course, the use or how can we say, instrumentalization of sustainable development considerations and measures as a trade barrier, especially in cases when the measure is not well-grounded in the best scientific evidence available. So the chapter promotes some of the very basic principles of the EU Green Deal, at the same time as it seeks to address concerns that some of the measures adopted within this framework will not be used to impair concessions that were made in the agreement. This is not an easy task. The text of the chapter requires a lot of work and creativity of our negotiators, and I suspect that its implementation will require an even greater amount of ingenuity by both sides. So, to discuss the interaction between the EU Green Deal with the Mercosur EU trade agreement, especially the TSD chapter, not only in the text of the chapter, but also in the perspectives of its implementation, I could not imagine a better composition for this panel. I will not make a formal introduction since you have the bios in the event flyer, but of course I cannot refrain from saying some very brief words about them. Starting with Pedro Mariano. He's a colleague of mine here at the Brazilian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, who has been seconded to the Ministry of Environment and became, I think it's fair to say, one of our top experts on TSD issues. He's our lead in those topics in many different negotiations. We have also Paulo Gazzotti, who is the head of the unity responsible for Latin America in the European Commission. He has been my counterpart when I was in the trade negotiations unit before being the head of the market access division in the MFA, when we had the chance to discuss all the preparatory work for signing the agreement, for its ratification, and more recently for its successful implementation. So what I can say is Paulo is exactly the kind of see on the other side of the table, as he's very pragmatic, very focused on getting things done. And thanks to guys like, I think it's fair to say that thanks to guys like him, we were able to sign and ratify the agreement in spite of all the noisy opposition to its successful conclusion. And Henrique Moraes, finally, last but not least, is also a colleague and friend here at the MFA. He was my predecessor at the trade negotiations unit, and he was, of course, a key figure in the team that was able to find the creative solutions that allow us to conclude not only the agreement with the EU, but also other very important trade agreements for Brazil, for Mercosur, such as the EFTA and Singapore. So as discussant to this panel, we have Leonardo Rossi, who is a researcher at the FGV, Center of Global Law, and I'm sure he will make sure that everything we say here will be fully compliant with the high-level requirements of such a prestigious institutions like the FGV. So after the kind words, let us make the tough questions. But before that, of course, let me allow our speakers to make their initial remarks on the subject of this panel. So I will first pass the floor to Pedro Mariano. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister Augusto, for the kind words. Good morning, good afternoon, colleagues. Great to see many friendly and familiar faces. Also to attend an event hosted by my alma mater. Always a pleasure. Pleasure to see you again as well. Paolo, we were in a similar panel last week, hosted by at the WTO Trade and Environment Week. And next week, I'm in Brussels to discuss a very similar topic, so maybe we'll meet there again. Anyway, colleagues, as the EU-Mercosur agreement more than 2 decades concluded, there are, of course, many different views and perspectives from Brazil. So my focus is on the environmental clauses negotiated between 2023-24, which I coordinated on behalf of Mercosur. And of course, as also mentioned, this is a personal view that does not necessarily reflect the views of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs or the Ministry of Environment, where I have been seconded. So in 2023, Mercosur countries were presented with a side letter from the EU with different clauses, environmental clauses to be included in the agreement, presented as a sine qua non conditions for signing the agreement. And while some of them expressed legitimate concerns, given not only the climate crisis, but also deforestation rates observed in some Mercosur countries in previous years, let alone that, they were to some extent intrusive, for instance, with specific reference to budgets of environmental enforcement agencies, a specific target of half of curbing deforestation rates by 50% in 2 years, basically, which ultimately we did achieve. Luckily, as you know, my boss has been making a very good job, but to include that in a trade agreement was seen as not feasible, right? It's there are many difficulties in mixing both regimes, and including a specific deforestation rate was very difficult. And while mixing elements from both trade and environmental regimes, we noted a neglect of including or referring to the key principles of the multilateral environment agreements, as of course has been mentioned, CBDR, the idea that we cannot, while we share the same commitments and goals, we cannot advance all at the same pace. And especially if we look through the consumption side as the EUDR does, our historical responsibilities are even further apart, right? Given how companies and consumers in the global north have benefited from emissions and production in the global south. But anyway, these were presented as must-haves from the EU side. So our goal was ultimately to find a balance, right? And of course, on the part of Brazil, we can have ambitious environmental commitments reflecting the very stringent and ambitious environmental legal framework we have domestically, and also the historical leadership in climate and nature diplomacy. And so what our goal was to balance these ambitious commitments, which ultimately we have in the text, with, let's say, positive incentives. Some of them have already been mentioned, and also with specific reference to these key principles of MEAs. Entering in the nitty-gritty of the text, we note that in addition to standard TSD articles, such as right to regulate, the obligation to uphold levels of environmental protection, and a general commitment to implement our respective commitments under MEAs, the EU-Mercosur Agreement also contains important new concrete and operational commitments, right? And the first, of course, that comes into mind is the explicit inclusion of the Paris Agreement as an essential element, in the same par as maintaining a democratic regime and not developing nuclear weapons. And of course, this is we see it as a legitimate concern, given how serious the climate crisis is. It was, of course, difficult to balance the inclusion of such a specific provision, environmental provision of such a nature in a trade agreement. But of course, again, given this was presented as a must-have, our goal was to really make sure that it was very clear and objective, and not providing margin for subjective interpretations and different interpretations. And while it was a difficult discussion, it was a positive one. And I think that what we managed to achieve was really remarkable in this sense. And in addition to that, of course, there are specific measures to address deforestation. This was also a key component, maybe the core element in the whole annex that was negotiated, and to prevent rolling back or weakening the capacity of environmental law enforcement agencies, right? Environmental law enforcement agencies. And to make sure that trade, which in the case of Brazil is one among different sources of land use change, does not contribute to environmental harm, and that the trade supports the effective effective enforcement of environmental laws. So we have conservation commitments there, but coupled with a recognition of the need to enhance means of implementation, finance cooperation, and a specific recognition of the need to take into account the challenges of developing countries when complying with policies such as the EUDR, right? And I think some of these have already mentioned. There are many the difficulties especially for smallholder producers, in complying with some of these requirements. Still in the topic of forests and the EUDR, a key provision is the commitment by the EU to use, not uniquely, but to use as a source. And the ultimate language there was suggested by Frank here present, and I'm very grateful for your insight on this particular topic, because after months discussing potential language, having the legal expert on the room really with providing us with some fresh ideas was really helpful, and in this particular case. So in the case of Brazil, our national monitoring system, INPE, it provides reliable data and provides objective, science-based information that has been guiding our public policy aimed at curbing deforestation for nearly 4 decades now. And we achieved significant results. We've reduced deforestation by more than 80% between 2004 and 2012, at a time where agricultural exports were shooting up almost 300%. So this explains how trade is not the only source of deforestation. And in the case of Brazil, it's the dynamics are really specific and a lot more complex. And these there's so many technicalities involved, but ultimately these guide our public policy aimed at curbing deforestation, right? So we already think that it is somewhat intrusive to impose a set of criteria for exporting countries. So at the very least, important to make sure that we rely on that we use the same data that has been guiding our public policy on this topic, and not having to base our public policy and domestic efforts on a foreign system or data, which would be unacceptable for us. And in addition to that, despite having divergent views on EUDR, this does not prevent us from cooperating to really find a balance here. But in addition to that, we've also, to balance the commitments on climate and forests, the annex include a set of positive incentives. One has been mentioned, the idea to establish a list of environmentally and socially responsible products to receive enhanced market access and trade facilitation measures. And these are coupled with targeted references to cooperation, capacity building, technical assistance. And these measures ultimately create constructive pathways for producers and for supply chains to meet higher sustainability standards. And finally, from our side, we note that the agreement includes specific mentions to principles 11 and 12 of the Rio Declaration. As I mentioned, that we thought that if we're bringing the commitments and the elements from MEAs, we really needed to couple them with similar references. And these contain, respectively, a recognition that environmental standards should reflect the environmental and developmental context in which they apply, and that environmental measures should not be disguised restriction on trade, and that unilateral measures should be avoided. And this is particularly important in our view in the case of EUDR, where, as I heard correctly, the EU wants to, quote unquote, erase the regulatory bar. And while this may be a legitimate goal, we, as Brazil and as developing countries, we cannot endorse criteria universally that may only be feasible with a very large amount of agricultural subsidies that are not available to developing countries. And recalling that since we did not move the needle one notch in Article 20 of the WTO Agreement on Agriculture, which established a mandate to reform agricultural subsidies, we have never had a level playing field in agricultural trade, as it continues to favor countries with higher fiscal capacities. And also the setting of standards unilaterally may disregard graphical production conditions. They may products with an even worse carbon or environmental footprints, and perhaps open a Pandora box for other countries to also start establishing their criteria based on their own comparative advantages. So if we think that principle 11 was really fundamental there to provide the right balance that enabled us to find the right landing zones, mixing and balancing the ambitious commitments with references and that are also fundamental. In closing, our assessment is that we managed to find compromise and balance ambitious environmental commitments with positive incentives. And now we look forward to working with the EU and also our Mercosur partners to ensure that the agreement is effective, equitable, and contributes to our shared goals of sustainable development, climate stability, and ecosystem conservation. I stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Pedro. This was really a very, very comprehensive presentation of the TSD chapter and its annex. I think you touched upon very, very important questions. You mentioned the very delicate and sensitive task that you faced in the last stage of the negotiations, trying to balance this more intrusive demands with standard provisions of TSD chapters, such as the right to regulate. You mentioned the commitment to use the data provided by Mercosur countries to verify compliance with, for example, traceability requirements to enter the European market. This is a very important topic. This is a very important point, I think, of the annex to the TSD chapter, that maybe we can get back to this point further down on the debate. You mentioned the positive incentives that we have, the positive agenda that we have in the chapter and its annex, such as the enhanced market access to products of the bioeconomy, of sustainable goods, and this is really a positive agenda that both sides can develop during the implementation of the agreement. And finally, the agricultural subsidies that are always an issue that we cannot forget. It's been a long time since the Doha round came to a stalemate in 2008. And sometimes we forget that this is still a reality that creates a very asymmetric situation when we compare agricultural production in different countries, especially developed countries vis-a-vis developing countries. But before these are very, I think, interesting topics for debate. But before we develop these topics further, I will pass the floor to my friend Paulo Garzotti. Paulo, you have the floor.
Ciao, Augusto. Thanks, and thanks a lot for your nice word. Same here. It was it's great to see you all again. And when I see Pedro, Enrique, and you, and I mean, I feel like I'm back in the basement of Itamaraty. Then when you quote the 2008 Doha round, when I was in Geneva struggling to do that, then the memory lane is really very, very deep. So thanks a lot for that. I think Pedro made a wonderful explanation of the various elements of the agreement. So I would rather focus on what was, like is said in the program, the EU perspective into it. Why, what was the EU wanted to take out of this TSD chapter? First of all, I want to come and say that that was a fixation of the EU. So there's a trade and sustainable development chapter in the agreement because the EU strongly insisted to have it. Jokingly, a former negotiators told me that the first meeting that they have on the TSD chapter, some delegations on the Mercosur side didn't show up because they thought this is a trade agreement, is not an environmental agreement. What should we be talking about here? Still, thanks to the constructive attitude of both sides, we got to a very good already sustainable development chapter in 2018 when the political conclusion of the negotiation was achieved for the first time. But at that moment in time, as Pedro indicated, started in the European Union a lot of problems related to the environmental policies of some Mercosur countries. The deforestation agenda, for many reasons, become very hot. At the same time, we changed the trade commissioner in the Commission. And when asked by the European Parliament, the new trade commissioner, what he would have done about Mercosur, he said, it's a great agreement, I'm gonna get it signed, but first I need more reassurances on the deforestation policies of our partner countries, and I need more granular provisions on, in particular on deforestation and general sustainable development. That what's led the European Union to present its first proposal to the Mercosur countries, And the first proposal of the European Union was actually an interpretative instrument. But you are much better lawyers than I am here, and you know that with an interpretative instrument you can do a lot of things. And clearly Pedro, Enrique, Augusto thought that where the European Union, the Commission, was trying to go with this interpretative instrument was a little bit too far for an interpretation. So they came back with another idea, which was a broader set of issues covering aspects that were not just on TSD. And at that moment in time, more or less in the second half of 2023, we start really discussing about some amendments to the agreement, including a protocol on sustainable development. For us, the overall rationale is what Pedro said: ensure that trade contributes to sustainable development, avoid a race to the bottom in order to get better conditions for trade and investment, strengthen the multilateral governance based on multilateral agreements, and then have, of course, a long-term joint engagement, a positive agenda under the agreement. I think that the third point, the strengthen multilateral governance based on multilateral agreements, that's where the tension is deeper between the approach that we had in the European Union to this and the one of Mercosur country, in particular Brazil. In the Brazilian diplomatic genetic code, I would even say, the mixing too much the trade governance with the multilateral environmental agreements governance is not seen positive. Is something that is seen as problematic, and that to a certain extent was surprising as well for us as EU negotiator. We would have thought that putting in a trade agreement some idea and principle that Mercosur countries would share would have helped consolidate or almost binding these agreements in international commitments would have been positive. Instead, no, regardless of the objectives that, as Pedro said, for example, Brazil has and has achieved in environmental governance and government, the idea of mixing this up and linking this up to trade elements was seen as problematic. And all the tension and all our negotiation was around that in my view, trying to come together with a common understanding on that. Now, at the same time, what do we have achieved trying to get these two elements together? First of all, I want to come that the European Union was coming from a communication, a political announcement that the Commission made in 2022 about how the trade and sustainable development chapter of the EU with third countries should be negotiated. That was after 2019, and in this communication on TSD, what we call the TSD review communication, there were two fundamental elements that stood out. One, the so-called sanctions. So the fact that by violating trade and sustainable development obligations, you should have faced consequences on your trade access and your market access under the benefits under the agreement in terms of trade. And second, that Paris, the agreement on climate change of Paris, should have become an essential element of this agreement in line with Article 60-61, I can't remember, of the Vienna Convention. Now, in the negotiation, clearly, very clearly since the beginning, the Mercosur countries rejected the idea of having a dispute settlement system that would have allowed to suspend concessions under the agreement for violation of the sustainable trade and sustainable development chapter. That was clear, and that is an immediate effect of what I was saying before, of the refuse to have the trade agreements tangling up too much with the multilateral environmental governance, which was exactly what instead right or wrongly, quite a number of political forces in Europe wanted to see, so to use trade agreements in order to promote that element. On Paris as an essential element, instead, clearly became a key issue, even if there's a lot of other elements in the protocol and the TSD chapter, as Pedro explained. A key issue on which eventually we find as well a very balanced and good language with the language of being party to the agreement in good faith. Some may say that this is less vague of what we have proposed earlier in the agreement. Some might say that is even vaguer of than what we had on the table before. But you know, this ambiguity and probably is what led as well to an understanding on this. Now, I want to underline as well quickly the importance of the positive agenda for this. It has been said about the list, both for products that are in favor of indigenous people living in the forest, so that we promote by trade the economic benefits to these particular populations, and the idea of a list of environmentally friendly products. We haven't called it in environmental goods because that would have mixed up and made confusions with the WTO language, but basically is what we meant, and that is an interesting avenue that could be promoted as well during the future negotiations of the agenda of the agreement, future implementation of the agreement that will involve a negotiation dimension. So that was our perspective to the agreement. For us in the European Union, this is a key element of selling the agreement to our civil society. Indeed, part of the Sustainable Development chapter is as well the creation of domestic advisory groups, of having civil society forums. So for us, it's very important that these elements are received and accepted by civil society, because of course, this trade and sustainable development dimension is coupled with another element from an EU perspective, at least from the EU public perspective, which is if we trade with third countries, these third countries should more or less be bound by the same set of principles that we have. And then, of course, the degree to which you force this principle, there are some that would like simply, you know, the proponents of mirror clauses, that they would like to have the full set of environmental regulations of the Union simply applied to third countries. Other than understand that this has to be more at the level of principles. But this dimension of instead of trade being part of our environmental and labor agenda is something that differentiates, I would say, our society in our way, the way as well Mercosur countries and the European Union see this. This tension, of course, is present as well in other, not just in how the way we negotiated agreement, but as well in pieces of EU law, as was discussed before. And I do hope that this agreement and the implementation of this agreement and the discussions that we're going to have under this agreement will help in promoting the mutual understanding of how we see these kind of global problems. Because I think overall, surely with Brazil, we are on the same line in terms of the objectives we need to achieve. And I do hope that implementing the agreement, we're going to do a further step together in that direction. Thanks a lot. Augusto, over to you.
Thank you. Grazie, Paolo. This was a really very good recap of the negotiation process. Of course, from the European perspective, you mentioned some very important issues. When you say that Brazilian diplomacy is especially reluctant to mix trade with these multilateral regimes, I think one thing that comes to my mind, of course, is that this is a gray zone in trade law. As you know, the WTO acquis stopped in the Uruguay round. We had some punctual, some isolated progress in some trade facilitation and other agreements, but trade and sustainability, there's no multilateral benchmark on those issues. So when we include these topics in the agreement, of course, there's a risk of exactly the topic that we are discussing in this event, the externalization of a country or a jurisdiction on criteria and principles to other realities in which those principles and regulations might not be the most appropriate. So this was an issue that came to my mind, but you mentioned also the positive agenda that we should work on in the implementation of the agreement. And I think I hope we do have time to develop these issues further in the debate. But before that, let me pass the floor to my colleague, my friend, Henrique Moraes.
Thank you, Augusto. Good afternoon. Let me start by first thanking Paula Almeida and her team at GV Rio for the kind invitation. And of course, it's a pleasure to meet on screen again, Pedro, Mariano, and Paolo. It's as if we were back again negotiating some pending footnote somewhere in the agreement. So I was asked to talk about the challenges for the agreement, and I will get to that in a minute. But I just want to pick up on a couple of points that have been raised by both Pedro and Paolo, and to yourself as well, Augusto, before I start. And I think I'll preface the discussion on the challenges on positioning the agreement in the context in which it has been negotiated, right? Specifically the last stage, the one that we were all part of. Because of course, the world of 2024, when we concluded the negotiation, is a completely different world from 2019, when the political agreement was reached, right? We had a number of convulsions, global convulsions, COVID, all sorts of geopolitical frictions that have put both Mercosur and the EU in a different relative position, but interestingly, a position that made it even more recommended that we got together, right? And I think that explains a lot of what has been possible to achieve in the negotiations. And for me, one of the main takeaways of the context in which we negotiated this last stretch of this long process of negotiation was the opening that this global context offered both Mercosur and the EU to innovate. The agreement is full of new solutions across a wide range of areas, not least in sustainable development, and I'll talk about a bit about this in a while. So it's an agreement that is, in a way, it's representative of this world where all the templates of FTAs that have prevailed in the 90s, while they provided some basis for us, we also had enormous room to find new solutions that were tailor-made to the needs of Mercosur and the EU. And I think the new annex on sustainable development, Annex 18A, is a clear evidence of that. So getting to the idea of the challenges, of course, the challenges are many, but I will focus on what to me is what we can already identify as challenges, and of course, they have to do with the implementation, right? I think if I could encapsulate for me what is the biggest challenge is that we waste the enormous opportunities that the agreement gives both Mercosur and the EU to make the most of the agreement. We open a lot of interesting doors, positive agendas with the agreement, and I think we have to make the most of it. And the main challenge is to waste this opportunity. Now let's zoom in a bit on the new annex on TSD, and I'll just offer you one additional, let's say, take on where that annex comes from. And I know Pedro mentioned this with specific examples, but I think it's worth also saying that since we already had from 2018, as Paulo mentioned, agreed with the EU on the, let's say, more traditional, quote unquote, template of a TSD chapter, when we were presented with the interpretative side letter from the EU, we thought, listen, if we want to be serious, we thought in Brazil, if we want to be serious about integrating trade and sustainable development, let's be serious. We're not going to solve deforestation by taking people to court. No, it's not because you're going to file a case against a Mercosur member before a panel of experts that you're going to address seriously and concretely the problem of deforestation. You may have a good case to go to the press and say, we're doing something, we're putting them against the wall. But honestly, we're not solving that. So we thought in the Brazilian government, let's focus on one element that is present in the pre-existing TSD chapter, but that we could do more with it. And that is the element of the collaborative approach to combining trade and sustainable development. So we thought in the government, what kind of counter-proposal or what kind of language can we offer that focuses on a collaborative and maybe non-lawyerly approach to addressing the link between trade and sustainable development? How can we make the people who live in the Amazon, for example, take advantage of the agreement? And more, how can we put on the table, in addition to the TSD chapter that we already have, an instrument that is balanced? Because obviously it's not just Mercosur countries that have homework to do in terms of sustainable development. So it's a common problem. We all have things to do. So how can we integrate? And this latter point that I mentioned has a direct link to one of the opportunities that we see in the agreement from the Mercosur side. The context that I highlighted earlier is a context in which you see businesses desperately seeking to diversify dependencies, redesign their supply chains for strategic reasons, but also to decarbonize. Perhaps no other agreement offers the EU the opportunity that the EU-Mercosur agreement offers to meet these goals, right? We're not entangled in geopolitical frictions. We have clean energy matrices. So why not, in a collaborative manner, put in writing, in a text, commitments that may foster this kind of goal? Now, of course, we cannot put in writing to meet these goals what lawyers would call hard law, because these are things that have to be constructed. And that is exactly the approach that we sought to encapsulate in the counter-proposal that we presented that ultimately led to Annex 18A. So what challenges are we facing when we deal with the agreement, and in particular, this chapter? But what I'll tell you, I think applies across the board to the entire agreement. I think perhaps the main challenge in making sure the agreement works is that we have to be mindful as governments that the agreement changes the way we manage our bilateral relationships, right? So we have a number, as Paulo mentioned, we have a number of settings that will bring together not only the governments, but also businesses and the civil society organizations from both sides. We have to learn how to operate in this new environment and make the best of it in a collaborative manner. No lectures, exchanging views, transparency. And I think this will take time. It might sound something quite easy, but I think it will be a learning process for both of us, but we'll have to learn it. And I think when we move out of the government side and focus on the businesses and the civil society organizations, and now I'm linking to the positive agenda that has been raised by both Pedro and Paulo, there's a lot to be done here. My previous co-panelists have already mentioned the commitment to pinpoint a few sustainable products and give them some sort of preferential treatment or facilitate their integration to trade between Mercosur and the EU. But there's much more than that. For example, there's language, again, soft law language, but important commitments in any way that seek to promote business integration with a view to taking advantage, for example, of the clean energy matrices in the Mercosur countries. And we see the war in Ukraine and now the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. Businesses are desperate to look for not only energies, but if they can, sustainable and renewable energy. And the agreement offers that. The agreement offers, and in particular this Annex 18A, offers a very interesting platform for businesses to get together and find opportunities to clean their matrix, to decarbonize their matrices. Just a brief footnote, here in the Netherlands, I'm very happy to see that the Dutch are pioneering a number of initiatives connecting their industry to, for example, hydrogen, green hydrogen in Brazil. It's exactly this kind of example that I think is something that we have to take advantage. So the main challenge, if we can try to approach this broadly, is to make sure that we use all the opportunities that the agreement offers, not only to governments and how we will manage our bilateral relations, but also to businesses and civil society organizations. Because of course, we're committing to transparency. We in Brazil don't have any problem with transparency. We welcome the participation of civil society. The agreement only reinforces this kind of commitment, but we will have to learn how to operate in this new, let's say, operational system. I will stop here. There's, of course, much more to say, but I'm happy to take questions, and I'll hand it back over to you, Augusto. Thank you.
Thank you, Enrique. Thank you very much. This was a really nice intervention. I will just highlight 2 points that you mentioned. I think the one on the collaborative approach is really key to the implementation of this agreement. I think we cannot, as you said, we cannot kid ourselves that there's a lot of scope to the instrumentalization of what we have in the agreement for just having nice headlines in the press and so on. But the key point, I think, is using this, what we have in the agreement, to set a positive agenda for the both sides during the implementation of the agreement. Another point that you mentioned is how we are living in a different world, and how the difference between 2019 and 2024. And I think it's fair to say that 2026 is really different from 2024 as well. So we should really be mindful of this, the geopolitical window that I think was key to the conclusion of the negotiation in 2024, and I think will be key to the implementation of the agreement as well. We should make sure that we get this agreement right, that we make it live to the commitments that we made in the agreement, and I'm sure this will be highly beneficial to the two sides. I think we still have like 5-10 minutes, so I will pass the floor to our discussant, Leonardo, for his questions to our speakers. Thank you for his comments and questions, of course.
Hi, good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear.
Okay, thank you very much. I would like to thank Mr. Castro for moderating this panel, and also for the insightful talks by the three participants, Mr. Pontes, Mr. Garzotti, and also Mr. Moraes. I have here four main points that you can choose to answer the way that suits you for the best. The first one concerns something that it was brought by Mr. Pontes on the question of the relationship on the subsidies and also the sustainability commitments, whether there is a way to reconcile these two things, and also something that it was brought by Mr. Garzotti, once that there is not a proper dispute settlement within the TSD chapter, what is the role of the civil society in the implementation of the agreement? My second main point is more broader one on the geopolitics element, that since there are two main instruments, the interim trade agreement that's being provisionally applied since May, and the partnership agreement that it will enter into force after the procedures, and it will substitute the trade agreement. What currently are the key factors that could influence the implementation of the agreement, and also since the trade agreement is being provisionally applied, how it could shape the broader political conditions for the eventual entry into force of the partnership agreement. And and because of that, because of this splitting, there is also, as pointed out by Mr. Castro, a request before the Court of Justice of the European Union on the legality of the splitting in these two instruments. So I would like to ask you to touch upon whether there are any institutional or political risk of this decision of the trade agreement being provisionally applied since May. And my final point concerns something that it was brought in the earlier panel on the rebalancing mechanism, that it is something new on the EU FTAs that basically says that a party can seek some form of countermeasures when the original balancing of concessions is being affected, whether or not the agreement is being breached. So I would like you to expand, if I may, a little bit on this mechanism and how the EU and the Brazil see the potential operation of the rebalance. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Leonardo. So very important and interesting questions on the role of civil society, geopolitics, the provisional application of the agreement. So maybe on this issue, on the issue of the legal opinion by the Court of Justice, maybe Paulo can give us an update. If I'm not wrong, the three issues that will be subject to the legal opinion are the splitting mechanism, the precautionary principle, and the rebalancing mechanism. So maybe Paulo can give us an update on the process in the European Union and the rebalancing mechanism. So maybe we can start with you, Paulo.
Sure. Thanks, Leonardo. Thanks, Augusto. On the importance of TSD, we have basically two constituencies that challenge this agreement. One is the environmental constituency, one is the agricultural constituency. One is dictated by economic reasons, the agri one, which we have tried to explain to them, yes, probably overstated. The one on environment is basically considering that commitments on sustainable development should have the same level of importance, both legally and in implementing phase, as the commitments on licensing, SPS, or anything else that affects trade. So for them, the fact that a violation of a commitment TSD does not lead to a so-called trade sanctions is something that is seen as making this commitment something of a lower grade. Actually, if you in debates, they normally tell you that these commitments, they don't have legal value, as they confound, they probably mix up the idea of having a dispute settlement system with sanction having legal value. Of course, they have legal value, but that's the debate, and that in Europe is a collective preference, if I can call it like that, is something that is present in our system and something that we need to take into account when negotiating agreement and when, particularly on the Mercosur Agreement, we are moving into a vote by the European Parliament. That brings me to the legal architecture of the agreement. The legal architecture is the same that we have proposed and the Council and the Parliament have adopted for the agreement with Chile. So an interim trade agreement and a framework agreement with the political cooperation part into it as well. The Commission, of course, is confident that this is perfectly in line with the treaties. On top of that, the argument. So on that, I'll come to the opinion of the court that the Parliament has requested. When we, the Commission, have proposed the decision to sign, the Council has adopted the decision to sign. We have signed, and the step after that would have been the vote by the Parliament on what we call the consent to the agreement. At that moment in time, the Parliament, with a very limited short margin, 10 votes, voted in order to ask the European Court of Justice for an opinion, indeed, on 3 points. One, if it was in line with the treaty to have two agreements instead of one, even if the mandate adopted by the Council, according to the Parliament, was indicating an association agreement. As a matter of fact, it is known that the very mandate, which is not public, but refers explicitly to an interim trade agreement leading up to a further broader agreement, which was in the mandate of 1999. And why it was there? Because it's exactly the same thing that we have done with Mexico in 1997 and 2000. So we are confident that that would work. The second is the precautionary principle. In the Mercosur Agreement, we have basically the same language of the SPS agreement in the WTO, 5.7, 5.8, if I remember correctly, provisional application of the SPS agreement. So on that line, unless the European Union has been in breach of the WTO agreement is in breach of the treaty since 95, we think that we are on solid grounds. Finally, on the rebalancing mechanism, indeed, is not something new. The rebalancing mechanism is the language that is used, let's say, as heading. But if you look into the agreement, this is a non-violation complaint. We have a non-violation complaint that exists in the WTO since 1947. So there as well, we don't think that we are confident that the court will judge in our favor. Of course, all due and deference to the court. That's my personal opinion, and we hope that the court will judge in that direction. What happened since the Parliament asked the opinion of the court? The court takes time. On average, in the past, has taken between 16 months and 25 months to to pronounce itself on an opinion requested by an institution. So that means that the vote of the Parliament, according to rules of procedure of the Parliament, can only take place when the opinion is known. So we'll have to wait more or less 2 years, let's say. We had to wait 2 years for the vote of the Parliament. The decision of the Council on signature includes a decision to apply provisionally if and when at least one member of the Mercosur would have ratified the agreement. And that where, if you want, the Mercosur kind of surprised us or not. Surely Brazil, because I think it's the fastest agreement ever ratified by Brazil in history, or one of the fastest. As a matter of fact, we signed on the 17th of January, and by the 31st of March, all of the 4 Mercosur countries had ratified the agreement. And so, as a matter of law, the union, the council decision, the union had to notify the decision on provisional application to the depository in Paraguay, and that was happened, and that we have the agreement provisional apply as of the 1st of May. Now, is a provisional application. So we need, we're going to apply it now for, let's say, a couple of years, but then we're going to have the vote of the Parliament. And the vote of the Parliament will be the vote that actually determines the entrance into force of the agreement. Only with the parliamentary consent, then the Council can decide to conclude the agreement and lead to the entry into force. So we got 2 years to convince the Parliament, apart from the court that we hope will tell the Parliament that what we've done is legal, is legally correct, but to convince as well the Parliament that agreement works. And you know, the British people say, in English, they say that you never get a second chance to give a first impression. So we need there to be, that's why we care so much on both sides to make sure that this agreement delivers, because we have this political judgment that needs to be given by the European Parliament in 2 years' time. So that's why those elements of sustainable development, but generally of the perception that the preoccupations, be it on environment or on agricultural terms, that have been expressed were overstated, and the benefits of the agreement were understated. That, in very simplistic terms, is what would be my case. If we manage to demonstrate that, is likely that we're going to have the majority we need, and the agreement will go forward. I hope I answered to your questions, Augusto and Leonardo.
Thank you very much, Paulo. Let's hope that we'll have no issue. But when we talk about this agreement, it's always with, as we say here in Brazil, with some drama. Thank you very much. So I pass the floor to Pedro.
Yes, thank you very much, Augusto. Well, on the framework and the let's say, I think Leonardo asked many different points there, and I think Paulo addressed them elegantly to an extent, given that could not possibly touch upon the internal mechanisms of the EU. The only topic that I think I could complement is the issue I raised on agricultural subsidies. And for us, the key element here is just that this has to be part of the discussion, right? The problem is 30 years after the mandate of the AOA, sometimes we forget that this is the major paying issue, the multilateral trading system, where and the reason why, in our view, we still don't have and have never had a level playing field in agriculture. And why does it matter? For instance, take the case of beef, which it's certainly one of the most sensitives, and I hear from Paulo that, of course, the agricultural caucus is one that's, of course, resistant to the agreement. But now, if we use the data from a study by Raoni Rajão from I think it's from 2020, the rotten apples of Brazilian agribusiness, he estimated that some 10% of our beef exports could be linked to deforestation. Right? I'm confident that these numbers, are much lower now, given the tremendous progress achieved in curbing deforestation. But anyway, matter if it's 1%, 5%. Yeah, fine. And it's something that we need to tackle head on. And as we've discussed, a cooperative approach is very much favored, right? Okay, but what about the other 90%-ish of our beef exports? If we look at their environmental footprint and carbon footprint, it will be significantly lower than let's say the standard EU beef production. That you will need gas to keep cattle warm in the winter. There's the issue with nitrogen, so on and so forth. So there are production systems that are only viable if they depend on significant amount of agricultural subsidies, and we know that the politics is very complicated, and there's a reason why the common agricultural policy takes so much of the EU budget. We acknowledge that, and we know it's extremely sensitive, but we just recall that this has to be a part of the discussion as well. That's in our quest, in our common endeavor to promote sustainable supply chains, we need to include this element so that we don't run the risk of favoring production systems that are only viable through many subsidies and therefore they would not be sustainable, considering the three-leg tool of sustainable development: economic, social, and environmental. They would not be sustainable. And similarly, it could be promoting systems that end up having probably have a worse environment or carbon footprint. You just say that it has to be part of the overall equation, and that's my take. I'll stop here.
Thank you very much, Pedro. Henrique, you have the floor.
Thank you, Augusto. Just very briefly, and I'm mindful of the time, I'll pick up on the point that I think Leonardo mentioned about how geopolitics can affect the period between now that the ITA is in force until when the provisional application is over and we have full application. I'll make it into a broader point. I think this period will show us, hopefully, that whether we can actually learn how to live with the agreement or not. I mean, the recent episodes that we had with AMR showed that we haven't yet internalized that we should be more collaborative. That, of course, doesn't mean giving any of the parties a privileged position, but at least sharing some information is welcome. But it's a long-term process, and I hope that these initial moments serve to instill a certain attitude that we're here to collaborate. The whole world is against us, let's put it this way. So it's not really wise to bash your partner with whom you have just signed one of the world's largest agreements. So, but again, it's a changing culture somehow. But I think this is what I would expect to see and hope, that we learn how to introduce this new culture and this new way of managing the relationship from now on. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Henrique. I think this is a wonderful conclusion to an excellent panel. I'd like to thank our speakers very much for the very insightful comments. And Paula, back over to you.
Well, thank you, Augusto, and thank you everyone for this excellent panel. Well, as we are coming to the end of this event, I would like to thank all the participants for your engagement, active engagement, and also your insightful discussions after the comments by our discussant. This was really, really rich. And we are really happy that this will contribute to academic and also diplomatic and practical discussions on the topic. And now, to conclude our program, we also have a pre-recorded closed session by Professor Jan Wouters, as he could not come online with us. So he's the director of the Leuven Center for Global Governance Studies and the Institute for International Law at KU Leuven. So his topic will be the EU efforts to uphold the international rules-based order. And this is the last closing speech that we'll have before closing the whole panel. Thank you.
Hello. I'm happy to participate in this beautiful webinar and would like to share some thoughts with you with regard to the contribution that the European Union makes to upholding the international rules-based order. We all know that that international order is under severe threat right now. We have seen various signs of the times. We have seen the resurgence of armed conflicts in various parts of the world, new forms of state aggression. We've also seen some countries becoming suddenly much less reliable in terms of upholding international law, in terms of upholding traditional alliances. We've seen the strong actions of the second Trump administration, pulling out of a great number of United Nations agreements and agencies, imposing unilateral tariffs, even threatening with the use of armed force against allies. We've also seen a much more belligerent Russia and a very assertive, if not aggressive, China. And in that difficult world, the EU has to navigate. Now, how does the EU contribute in upholding that rules-based order? First and foremost, it's important to highlight that the European Communion itself is strongly committed to international law. The EU's founding treaties strongly state that the European Union goes for multilateral solutions to address common problems, in particular in the framework of the United Nations. It also promises that the European Union will contribute to the strict observance and the further development of international law, and of course the respect of the principles of the United Nations Charter. So strong language about upholding international law, contributing to the further development of international law, working together with global and regional international organizations and its partners all over the world. Now, the question is, of course, how deep, how comprehensive are the EU's actions to contribute to upholding the international rules-based order. Let me just highlight a couple of them because it's impossible within this time frame to give an exhaustive presentation. For instance, in response to Russia's massive invasion of Ukraine since February 2022, the European Union has taken lots of actions in order to bring Russia back to a better path. It has shown a quite good degree of coherence, adopting in the meantime 20 sanctions packages, a unique, broad and deep set of sanctions hitting Russia and Belarus. It has, of course, also taken action through its member states in the United Nations, various UN General Assembly resolutions condemning Russia's aggression, calling for compensation, for accountability and responsibility, and so on. Also, in a coordinated effort with its member states, trying to marginalize Russia's position in international organizations. This being said, the impact on the ground, on the battleground at least, of the EU's actions has been pretty minimal. And that raises, of course, the question of impact and effectiveness. Another area of action is the, say, reactions in the face of the Trump II administration. When returning to power, President Trump has immediately taken a great number of unilateral actions, including leaving the Paris Agreement, leaving a quite sizable number of United Nations agencies, but also threatening its allies in Europe about, say, non-following up on the security guarantees of NATO, of the North Atlantic Alliance, and even in the early months of 2026, threatening to take Greenland, which is still part of Denmark, with armed force. And that has really sent shockwaves through Europe, through NATO allies. It has triggered a great effort of the European Union to reach much more autonomy in the field of security and defense. And that, I think, is really, for the moment, helping in transforming the European Union. Some even say that the EU is now becoming from a traditional peace project much more of a war project. I think that's slightly exaggerated, but the EU is putting a lot of efforts in indeed scaling up its security, defense and military potential. Apart from that, the European Union also works in responding to the unilateral threats for tariff rises of President Trump. It has negotiated the so-called Turnberry deal over the summer of 2025, a deal which is not a formal trade agreement, which was very difficult to negotiate because the US came with very strong demands. And if you look at the details of the deal, which I will not describe here, it is clear that it was rather one-sided and that the European Union, in spite of being one of the world's great trade global actors, has made deep concessions. And again, that did not create the stability and the predictability that was hoped for, because at repeated intervals, President Trump and his trade representative have threatened with new tariffs. So this is an ongoing story, and it, of course, begs the question, what should the EU do in case there will be new attacks in the field of trade and trade measures? Apart from that, the European Union is committed to contributing to the further development of international law, and there are many areas in which the EU has indeed participated in multilateral dynamics to develop new areas of international law. The Oceans Treaty, as it is called, that means the treaty for the maintenance of the high seas in areas beyond national jurisdiction, is one of the areas where the European Union and its member states have taken a strong lead. There are other areas, for instance, on cybersecurity. The EU is working very closely with the United Nations in order to at least try to bring more consensus in how international law should deal with such new security challenges. This being said, we know that the multilateral system, generally speaking, is in crisis, and that goes from the United Nations, that faces still an immense budgetary crisis, to organizations such as the World Trade Organization in Geneva, where the EU is a full member together with its 27 member states, which is a relatively young organization, only 31 years old, but already in a deep crisis, because there, on the one hand, there is a failure to make new overall trade agreements. The Doha Development Agenda is not delivering after so many years, but also the rise of new protectionism, and moreover, the demise of the so-called appellate body, meaning the appeals court in the case of trade disputes, which has been blocked by the United States and which now is dysfunctional. So in many aspects, the work of the WTO today is also very strongly complicated. There again, we should say that the EU has played a constructive role in setting up an alternative arbitration mechanism together with an increasing number of WTO members in order to fill, at least as a stopgap, the problem of a non-functional appeals body in the WTO. Apart from that, you wonder whether the EU is currently taking enough leadership in the WTO, because indeed, with an expanding membership, it has become very difficult on a consensus basis to agree on new international trade agreements. What we see is that the EU, in a certain way, in the past 20 years, has already concluded for itself that maybe the priority should not be the multilateral WTO, but rather focusing and prioritizing deep and comprehensive bilateral trade and partnership agreements with partnership countries all over the world. That process has started with, for instance, the Korea agreement many years ago, but it is now even accelerated, especially in view of the Trump administration's protectionist measures. So the EU is really speeding up trade negotiations, resulting in the new EU-Mercosur agreement that you have discussed in this webinar, but also in new agreements coming up with India, with, say, a variety of other partners. Mexico is also in the pipeline. Many new agreements, renewed agreements, and all of that contributing to weaving a network of deep and comprehensive trade relations, reliable trade relations with reliable partners. There is a bit of a tension line here, of course, with the multilateral area, because all of these bilateral deals create and contribute to a kind of spaghetti bowl, to use that language of the Columbia professor Bhagwati, and in a way make also international trade less foreseeable, less stable. There's another area where the European Union acts increasingly unilaterally or autonomously. And that is more problematic from a viewpoint of international law. There have been several fields in which the European Union now says we better contribute to globalization and to global governance by adopting our own rules, since we cannot agree at the international level. That is applied in the environmental field with, for instance, the adoption of CBAM, the so-called Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. It has also been the case with the adoption of the deforestation regulation that has been discussed in this webinar. And that has triggered many, many negative reactions, especially also from Brazil. And that has triggered the EU also to postpone the actual implementation of that deforestation regulation. This new tendency towards strategic autonomy, towards a more geopolitical union that cares deeply about safeguarding its own safe supply lines, that wants to be more independent, this new tendency creates a lot of unilateral regulation by the EU, and if you see the reactions of third countries, it is sometimes questionable whether those new initiatives are fully, I would say, strictly observant of international law as is required by the Treaty on European Union. So concluding, the European Union is a steadfast defender of the international rules-based order. It has taken many multilateral initiatives. It has contributed to many processes within the WTO, within the United Nations, within many of the specialized agencies of the United Nations. It works together with a great number of international partners, including Brazil. But there is also a tendency of the EU here and there to go for it itself, to go for it alone. And the question is whether this cavalier seul action is fully in line with international law, and in a way also whether that action does not negatively, if you wish, affect the EU's image as a multilateral actor that supports the rules-based international order. These things need to be further investigated, but I'm sure we will have plenty of opportunities in future webinars to discuss that. Thank you very much.